Evening. What are you doing out here?
Just rinsing the car, sir, my driveway.
Got a call about a suspicious person? Need your name and ID?
My house, name's Marcus Scott.
Uh-huh. You got something on you to prove that?
Wallets inside, not
On May
reachable.
17th, 2025, at approximately 2:15 p.m., Officer Jason Miller, a 24-year-old rookie with the Westlake Police Department and just 8 months on the force, made a decision that would ultimately destroy his law enforcement career. The dash cam from his patrol vehicle, his body camera, and the home security system at 1842 Oakwood Drive in Westlake, Ohio, all captured what happened next. What began as a man simply washing his car in his own driveway escalated into a confrontation that would expose troubling patterns within the department and raise serious questions about Officer Miller's conduct. If you've witnessed similar incidents in your community, leave a comment below about whether proper accountability followed. Officer Miller had already accumulated 3 civilian complaints in a short time on the force, all from minority residents alleging harassment and disrespectful treatment. Department records would later reveal these complaints were minimally investigated and dismissed by Lieutenant James Harmon, who described them as typical grievances from people who don't respect authority. The security camera mounted above the garage door shows Officer Miller driving slowly past the residence before making a U-turn and parking across the street. He observes Sergeant Washington for approximately 47 seconds before exiting his vehicle. At no point does Miller call on the stop or run the vehicle's plates through dispatch, which department policy requires before any investigative contact. Body camera footage clearly captures Miller's aggressive approach. The timestamp shows 14 hours, 17 minutes, and 22 seconds when he first addresses Sergeant Washington, who is wearing casual clothes, khaki shorts, and a polo shirt, while washing his BMW 5 Series sedan. The driveway is neat and well-maintained, with landscape borders and a basketball hoop visible at the far end. His tone immediately set the interaction on a confrontational path, noted Internal Affairs Captain Sandra Reynolds in her subsequent report. There was no reasonable suspicion articulated for the stop, and Officer Miller's hand placement near his weapon during a non-threatening encounter violated department de-escalation protocols. What Officer Miller couldn't have known was that Sergeant Marcus Washington, 42, had served with distinction for 17 years in the department. A decorated officer with specialized training in community policing, Washington had recently been appointed to lead the department's new community relations unit. He had moved to this predominantly white neighborhood 8 years earlier, where he lived with his wife, an attorney, and their 2 children. The body camera captures the exact moment when Miller's expression changes from aggressive confidence to shock as Washington identifies himself. The footage shows Miller's hand dropping from his holster as color drains from his face. But what happens next is even more revealing. Instead of immediately apologizing or acknowledging his error, Miller's next words would seal his fate. "You're lying," Miller says on the footage. "If you were really a sergeant, you wouldn't be in this neighborhood. Let me see that ID now." The security camera from the neighbor's house across the street captures the entire scene from a different angle, showing Miller forcefully grabbing Washington's arm and attempting to turn him around despite no resistance being offered. This crucial piece of evidence would later contradict Miller's written report claiming Washington had been confrontational and physically resistant. As Washington carefully reaches for his wallet, the body camera records him saying calmly, "Officer Miller, yes, I know who you are. You are making a serious mistake right now. I'm going to comply with your request for identification, but I want you to think very carefully about your next actions." The footage shows Washington producing both his driver's license and his police identification. The camera captures Miller's visible shock as he examines the credentials, his hands now visibly shaking. What would you do if you were stopped by police while on your own property? Subscribe to see how this officer's career implodes after this critical mistake, and how the department responds when confronted with irrefutable evidence of racial profiling. Miller's personnel file, which would later be examined during the investigation, revealed troubling patterns that had been overlooked. In his academy psychological evaluation, the examiner noted, "Candidate displays concerning rigidity in thinking and potential authority issues that may manifest in overcompensation." This warning was apparently dismissed by the hiring committee. Further investigation would uncover that Miller had been involved in 6 traffic stops of minority drivers in the same neighborhood over the previous month, none resulting in citations or arrests. In each case, Miller failed to properly document the reason for the stops as required by department policy. The security footage shows Miller backing away, still holding Washington's identification. "Sir, there must be some mistake," he stammers, as the reality of his situation becomes clear. Washington's response, captured clearly on the body camera, would later be played for the entire department during a mandatory training session on bias and proper conduct. "Officer Miller, there is indeed a mistake happening here. I'm going to give you an opportunity to explain exactly why you approached me on my own property without cause, why you threatened me, and why you attempted to detain me without articulating any reasonable suspicion of a crime." The footage shows Miller struggling to respond, his previous confidence completely evaporated. "I received a call about a suspicious person," he finally says. "That's interesting," Washington replies, "because I've been monitoring the dispatch channel on my department phone for the past hour, and no such call was received. Would you like to try again with the truth this time?" The cameras capture Miller's face as he realizes the depth of his predicament. His body language completely changes as he hands the identification back with a visibly trembling hand. What happens in the next 24 hours will completely dismantle Officer Miller's career and force the Westlake Police Department to confront uncomfortable truths about supervision and accountability. But first, we need to understand exactly how this incident escalates from a driveway confrontation to a department-wide reckoning. Do you think police departments do enough to screen for racial bias during hiring? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to see the complete destruction of this officer's career after his supervisor reviews all the evidence. By 5:30 p.m. that same afternoon, the incident at 1842 Oakwood Drive had already triggered a sequence of events that would permanently alter the trajectory of Officer Jason Miller's career. The security footage, body camera video, and Sergeant Washington's formal complaint had all been submitted to Internal Affairs Captain Sandra Reynolds. "I reviewed Officer Miller's approach 3 times and could identify no legitimate law enforcement purpose for the contact," Captain Reynolds stated in her preliminary report. "The subject was on private property, engaged in a lawful activity. No dispatch call was logged. No suspicious activity was apparent. The only visible factor that could have prompted this stop was the race of Sergeant Washington." What Officer Miller didn't realize was that his body camera had captured not just the confrontation, but also his comments to himself moments before approaching Washington. The enhanced audio, processed by the department's technical unit, clearly recorded Miller muttering, "Let's see what this guy's story is. No way he lives here." According to Lieutenant James Harmon's deposition taken 3 days after the incident, Miller came to me immediately following the encounter, visibly shaken. He claimed it was an honest mistake based on a suspicious person call. When I informed him no such call existed in the dispatch log, he changed his story, saying he had observed Washington looking into car windows on the street before approaching his own vehicle. This contradicted the security footage from Washington's home, which showed him emerging directly from his front door with car washing supplies and approaching only his own vehicle. Officer Miller's shifting explanations demonstrate consciousness of guilt, wrote Internal Affairs investigator Rebecca Chun. When confronted with evidence contradicting his initial justification, he fabricated an alternative narrative that could be easily disproven through available video evidence. By 7 p.m., Chief of Police Thomas Grayson had been briefed on the situation. His response was swift and unequivocal. "This department has zero tolerance for racial profiling," Chief Grayson stated in an email to command staff obtained through public records request. "The evidence I've reviewed shows a clear pattern of misconduct that demands immediate action. Officer Miller is suspended effective immediately pending full investigation." What made this case particularly damaging for Miller was Sergeant Washington's impeccable reputation within the department and the community. Washington had received the Medal of Valor in 2019 for rescuing 3 children from a burning building while off duty. He had been instrumental in developing the department's community outreach programs and had recently been selected to lead a regional task force on improving police-community relations. "Marcus Washington represents everything we aspire to be as police officers," stated Officer Danielle Rodriguez in her witness statement. "He's respected by everyone in the department. When I heard how Miller had treated him, I was physically sickened." The investigation quickly expanded beyond the single incident as Internal Affairs began reviewing all of Miller's stops and arrests since joining the force. What they found painted a disturbing pattern. Officer Miller conducted 37 discretionary stops in his 8 months of patrol duty, noted the Internal Affairs report. Of these, 31 involved minority subjects, 83.8%, despite the jurisdiction being only 17% minority. In none of these stops was contraband found or arrests made, suggesting a pattern of stops without legitimate law enforcement purpose. Even more damning was the discovery of text messages between Miller and 3 other officers in the department. In a group chat titled Real Police Work, Miller had written just 2 weeks before the Washington incident, "Cleaned up another neighborhood today. These people need to learn where they belong." When questioned about these messages during his administrative interview on May 19th, Miller claimed they were just jokes and not meant to be taken seriously. This explanation did little to mitigate the damage. The text messages reveal a mindset wholly incompatible with modern policing standards, wrote police psychologist Dr. Elaine Winters in her evaluation. They demonstrate not momentary lapses in judgment, but a persistent pattern of biased thinking that inevitably manifests in discriminatory enforcement actions. What complicated matters further for Miller was the discovery that he had failed to disclose a previous employment issue during his application process. Records obtained from the Lakeside Mall security office where he had worked before the police academy showed he had been formally reprimanded for excessive force and discourteous treatment of African-American teenagers he had ejected from the mall in 2023. Had this information been properly disclosed during background investigation, it would have raised serious red flags about candidate suitability, noted Human Resources Director Patricia Coleman in her statement to the investigation team. Meanwhile, Sergeant Washington's handling of the situation was drawing praise from department leadership and community members alike. Rather than immediately escalating the situation or demanding punitive action, Washington had submitted a measured, factual complaint focused on department improvement. "This incident represents a teaching opportunity," Washington wrote in his formal statement. "Officer Miller's actions reflect failures in our recruitment, training, and supervision processes. While individual accountability is essential, we must also examine the systemic factors that allowed these behaviors to develop and persist." Washington's approach stood in stark contrast to Miller's increasingly desperate attempts to salvage his position. On May 20th, Miller submitted a letter through his police union representative claiming that he was being unfairly targeted and that the stop had been procedurally justified based on training received. This claim prompted Field Training Officer Gabriela Martinez to come forward with additional information. During his training period, Miller repeatedly expressed concerns about changing demographics in certain neighborhoods. Martinez stated in her sworn affidavit, "I documented these comments and recommended additional cultural competency training, but my concerns were dismissed by Lieutenant Harmon, who told me to focus on teaching real police work instead of social justice." The investigation was now expanding beyond Miller himself to examine supervisory failures and potential departmental culture issues. Lieutenant Harmon was placed on administrative leave pending investigation of his oversight practices and handling of previous complaints against Miller. By May 21st, just 4 days after the incident, the story had reached local media. The Westlake Chronicle published an article titled, "Police Department Confronts Allegations of Racial Profiling," which, while not naming the officers involved due to the ongoing investigation, detailed the incident and the department's response. Community reaction was swift. At the city council meeting on May 22nd, dozens of residents spoke about their own experiences with Officer Miller and other officers. Westlake resident Jamal Thompson, 35, described being stopped 3 times in 2 months while driving in his own neighborhood. Each time, the officer asked whose car I was driving and what I was doing in that neighborhood. Thompson testified, "Each time, it was the same officer. Now I know his name was Miller. I filed a complaint after the second stop, but never heard anything back." The investigation was revealing not just individual misconduct, but systemic failures in how complaints were handled. Records showed that civilian complaints were routinely classified as unfounded, without thorough investigation, particularly when they involved allegations of bias or discrimination. The department's complaint classification system effectively buried legitimate concerns about officer conduct, stated external investigator Raymond Washington, no relation to Sergeant Washington. who was brought in to ensure impartiality. Of 28 bias-related complaints filed in the past 3 years, 0 were sustained. This statistical anomaly suggests a flawed investigative process. As the investigation continued, Miller's position became increasingly untenable. His union representative, initially supportive, began distancing himself after reviewing the complete evidence file. While the union is committed to ensuring due process for all members, we also recognize our obligation to uphold the integrity of the profession, stated Union Representative Michael Donovan. The evidence in this case presents serious concerns that go beyond simple procedural errors. What do you think is the appropriate consequence for an officer who engages in racial profiling? Should departments look more closely at patterns rather than isolated incidents? Share your thoughts in the comments below. By May 23rd, just 6 days after the incident, the preliminary investigation was complete. The findings would not only end Miller's career, but would trigger a department-wide reckoning that would permanently change policing in Westlake. That on May 24th, 2025, exactly 1 week after the driveway confrontation, the Westlake Police Department's internal investigation took a dramatic turn. What had begun as an isolated incident involving a single officer had evolved into something far more significant, a catalyst for departmental transformation. At 9:15 a.m., Chief Thomas Grayson called an emergency meeting of all command staff. The conference room security camera captured the grim expressions as they reviewed evidence that would permanently alter the department's trajectory. "What I'm about to show you goes beyond Officer Miller," Chief Grayson stated, according to the meeting transcript. "This is about who we are as a department and what we've allowed to happen under our watch." The revelation that transformed the case came from an unexpected source. Officer Danielle Rodriguez, a 3-year veteran who had worked several shifts with Miller. After seeing the initial evidence, she made the difficult decision to come forward with information that would break the department's unofficial code of silence. "I can no longer remain silent about what I've witnessed," Rodriguez wrote in her sworn statement. "On at least 7 occasions, I observed Officer Miller conduct stops of minority citizens without legal justification. When I questioned these actions, he told me this was how real policing was done and that Lieutenant Harmon had approved his proactive approach to neighborhood preservation." Even more damaging was the USB drive Rodriguez submitted to Internal Affairs. It contained audio recordings from roll call meetings where Lieutenant Harmon explicitly instructed officers to conduct extra patrols in what he called transitional neighborhoods and to make your presence known to outsiders who don't belong. "I recorded these briefings because I was uncomfortable with the direction we were being given," Rodriguez testified. "It contradicted everything I learned at the Academy about constitutional policing." The department's technical unit authenticated the recordings and confirmed Harmon's voice, giving instructions that directly violated departmental policy and constitutional standards for reasonable suspicion. These recordings demonstrate that Miller's actions were not those of a rogue officer, but rather the product of improper supervision and tacit approval from command staff, stated the updated Internal Affairs report. The incident with Sergeant Washington was merely the visible manifestation of a deeper cultural problem. At 11:30 a.m., Chief Grayson made the unprecedented decision to contact the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, voluntarily requesting a pattern or practice investigation of his own department. The integrity of this institution requires complete transparency and accountability, Grayson wrote in his letter to federal authorities. "We cannot effectively serve our community if we cannot honestly confront our failures." By noon, the investigation had expanded to include 5 additional officers and 2 supervisors who had been implicated in the recordings and subsequent witness statements. All were placed on administrative leave, pending further investigation. For Officer Miller, the new evidence eliminated any possibility of salvaging his career. His union representative withdrew support after reviewing the recordings, stating that the union cannot and will not defend conduct that undermines the constitutional rights of citizens. At 2:15 p.m., exactly 1 week to the minute after Miller had approached Washington in his driveway, the department's legal counsel informed Miller that termination proceedings had been initiated. The formal charges included violation of constitutional rights, falsification of official reports, conduct unbecoming an officer, failure to activate recording equipment at required times, and demonstrating bias in the performance of duties, according to the termination notice. Miller's response, captured in his final interview with Internal Affairs, revealed the full extent of the departmental culture that had enabled his behavior. "I was just doing what I was taught," Miller stated, according to the transcript. Lieutenant Harmon told us that certain neighborhoods needed to be protected from demographic changes, and that it was our job to make certain people feel unwelcome. He said the brass would back us up as long as we kept the paperwork clean. This statement directly implicated senior leadership and suggested a coordinated effort to conduct bias policing while evading accountability, exactly what Sergeant Washington had encountered that day in his driveway. Meanwhile, Washington himself had been asked by Chief Grayson to lead a newly formed professional standards unit with expanded authority to investigate misconduct and recommend policy changes. Sergeant Washington's composure and professionalism during this incident demonstrated exactly the qualities we need to rebuild trust, Chief Grayson stated in a department-wide email. He could have responded with justified anger, but instead chose to focus on systemic improvement. The transformation point came at 4:30 p.m. when Chief Grayson, with Washington at his side, held a press conference to publicly address the situation. Rather than minimizing the incident or defending the department, Grayson took full responsibility. "Today, I must acknowledge that our department has failed to uphold the constitutional rights of all citizens equally," Grayson stated before assembled media. The incident involving Sergeant Washington was not an isolated event, but a symptom of deeper problems that we are now committed to addressing. Effective immediately, we are implementing comprehensive reforms to ensure that such failures never occur again. The press conference footage, which would later be viewed over 2 million times online, showed Sergeant Washington stepping to the microphone to deliver what would become the defining statement of the case. "What happened to me in my driveway happens to people of color across this country every day," Washington said. "The difference is that I wear a badge. I had the protection of my rank and my position. Many citizens don't have that protection, and their complaints are dismissed or ignored. Today marks the beginning of a new approach to policing in Westlake, one based on constitutional principles, community trust, and equal protection under the law." The body camera footage from the original incident was released with appropriate privacy redactions, along with a detailed timeline of the investigation and the actions taken. This unprecedented transparency transformed public perception of the department. "In my 20 years covering law enforcement, I've never seen a department so openly acknowledge failure and commit to reform," wrote journalist Elena Ramirez in her analysis for the Regional Dispatch. "This represents a potential turning point in how police agencies respond to misconduct." For Miller, the consequences continued to mount. The county prosecutor's office announced a review of all arrests and citations he had issued during his time with the department, potentially affecting dozens of cases. The State Police Standards Commission opened an investigation to determine whether his certification should be permanently revoked. Officer Miller's actions reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional policing, stated Commission Director Anthony Morales. "The question before us is whether someone who has demonstrated such bias can ever be trusted with the authority of a law enforcement officer." By the evening of May 24th, just 7 days after the incident, Miller's law enforcement career was effectively over. But the ripple effects were just beginning to spread throughout the department and the profession. Lieutenant Harmon, faced with the audio evidence of his instructions to officers, submitted his resignation rather than face termination proceedings. 3 other officers implicated in the investigation were placed on extended administrative leave pending disciplinary hearings. The City Council unanimously approved emergency funding for department-wide training on constitutional policing, implicit bias, and procedural justice. They also established an independent civilian oversight board with actual authority to review complaints and recommend discipline. For Sergeant Washington, the incident that began with a simple car washing had become a catalyst for the changes he had long advocated. As he later explained in his testimony before the state legislature's Committee on Policing Standards, "Sometimes it takes a perfect storm of circumstances to create meaningful change. In this case, it took an officer who felt empowered to act on his biases, a supervisor who encouraged those biases, a department culture that tolerated discrimination, and the right evidence to expose it all. But it also took leadership willing to confront uncomfortable truths rather than hide behind excuses." The transformation was underway, but the full consequences of that fateful afternoon were still unfolding. For Officer Jason Miller, the realization was finally setting in. His career wasn't just suspended or in jeopardy. It was over. Do you think police departments should be more transparent about misconduct investigations? Would public disclosure of body camera footage in cases like this help build community trust? Share your thoughts below. By June 7th, 2025, 2 weeks after the driveway confrontation that exposed systemic issues within the Westlake Police Department, the consequences for Officer Jason Miller had cascaded far beyond simple employment termination. The Westlake City Attorney's Office had completed its review of Miller's conduct and reached a devastating conclusion. Based on the evidence gathered, including authenticated body camera footage, security video, and witness statements, we find that Officer Miller's actions constitute a clear violation of Mr. Washington's Fourth Amendment rights, wrote City Attorney Eleanor Patel in her official determination. This legal finding opened the door to potential criminal charges. On June 10th, County Prosecutor Marcus Jennings announced that his office was pursuing charges against Miller for official misconduct, filing false reports, and deprivation of civil rights under color of law. The evidence in this case demonstrates a willful disregard for constitutional protections, Prosecutor Jennings stated at a press conference. When an officer abuses their authority to target citizens based on race, they violate not just departmental policy, but state and federal law. Court documents revealed that Miller faced up to 5 years in prison if convicted on all counts. His attorney, David Schwartz, issued a brief statement. Officer Miller maintains that his actions were consistent with his training and departmental expectations. We intend to vigorously contest these charges. This defense strategy immediately backfired when the Police Academy Director, Captain Rebecca Torres, submitted a sworn affidavit directly contradicting Miller's claims. Our training explicitly emphasizes that race cannot be used as a basis for investigative stops, Torres testified. All cadets, including Officer Miller, received 40 hours of training on constitutional policing and bias-free enforcement. Miller's academy records show he scored 96% on the exam covering these topics, demonstrating he understood these principles. The consequences extended to Miller's financial future as well. On June 15th, Sergeant Washington filed a civil rights lawsuit against Miller personally, as well as against Lieutenant Harmon and the department. While Washington stated that any damages awarded to him will be donated to organizations supporting police reform, the lawsuit created significant financial exposure for Miller. Civil rights violations under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983 allow for personal liability that typically isn't covered by departmental insurance, explained civil rights attorney Vanessa Johnson in her analysis of the case. This means Officer Miller could be personally responsible for damages, legal fees, and costs. Miller's personal life was unraveling just as rapidly. Court records revealed that his mortgage lender had initiated foreclosure proceedings after he missed 2 payments following his termination. His wife filed for separation on June 18th, citing the public humiliation and financial devastation resulting from his actions. A deposition from Miller's Police Academy classmate, Officer James Chun, revealed the extent of Miller's isolation. He called me asking for support, but when he started saying the department had thrown him under the bus for doing what everyone does, I had to end the conversation. That's not what we do, and that's not what we were taught. Meanwhile, the investigation had expanded to examine all of Miller's previous law enforcement activities. The review uncovered disturbing patterns that further demolished any chance of him working in law enforcement again. Analysis of Officer Miller's traffic stops during his 8 months with the department shows that 83% involved minority drivers, despite minorities comprising only 17% of the local population, stated the Independent Audit Commission by the City Council. The disparity is statistically impossible to attribute to random chance. Even more damaging was the discovery of Miller's social media activity under a pseudonym account. The digital forensics team recovered deleted posts showing Miller had participated in private groups where officers shared racially derogatory memes and comments about minority communities. The content recovered from Officer Miller's accounts demonstrates a pervasive bias that is fundamentally incompatible with the oath to protect and serve all citizens equally, wrote digital forensics examiner Aisha Patel in her report. On June 22nd, the State Police Standards Commission held an emergency hearing to review Miller's law enforcement certification. The proceedings, which were live-streamed as part of the department's new transparency initiatives, included testimony from training officers, supervisors, and citizens who had previous encounters with Miller. During my traffic stop in March, Officer Miller asked me whose car I was driving, despite the vehicle being registered in my name, testified Dr. James Williams, a prominent local physician. When I asked why he stopped me, he claimed I'd failed to signal a turn, but his body camera footage clearly showed my signal was activated. The commission's decision was unanimous and unprecedented in its speed. Miller's law enforcement certification was permanently revoked, making him ineligible to serve as an officer anywhere in the state. The official findings cited demonstrable bias, dishonesty, and abuse of authority that render the individual unsuitable for the powers and responsibilities of a peace officer. For the Westlake Police Department, the consequences extended far beyond a single officer. The Department of Justice had launched a pattern or practice investigation that was uncovering evidence of systemic issues. Our preliminary review indicates that the department's early intervention system failed to flag Officer Miller despite multiple indicators of problematic behavior, stated DOJ Civil Rights Division Attorney Sarah Gonzalez. This suggests structural deficiencies in supervision and accountability mechanisms. Chief Grayson, rather than resisting the federal investigation, embraced it as an opportunity for transformation. "We cannot fix what we do not acknowledge," he stated in a department-wide memo obtained through public records request. "This investigation will help us identify and address the root causes that allowed discriminatory policing to occur." The consequences for Lieutenant Harmon were equally severe. The county prosecutor expanded the investigation to include charges of official misconduct and conspiracy against him based on the recorded roll call instructions and his pattern of dismissing complaints against officers under his command. Lieutenant Harmon created an environment where officers believed they would be protected when engaging in biased enforcement, stated the prosecutor's charging document. This constitutes not just supervisory failure, but active participation in civil rights violations. Harmon's attorney attempted to negotiate a plea agreement that would avoid jail time, but prosecutors were unwilling to offer leniency given the seriousness of the misconduct and the position of trust Harmon had occupied. For Sergeant Washington, the incident had transformed him into a reluctant national figure in the police reform movement. His measured response and focus on systemic improvement rather than personal retribution earned him invitations to speak at law enforcement conferences across the country. "What happened to my driveway that day was a symptom, not the disease," Washington testified before a congressional committee examining police accountability. "The disease is a culture that allows officers to believe they can act on bias without consequences. The cure is not just removing individual officers, but transforming the systems that produce and protect them." By July 1st, the Westlake Police Department had implemented sweeping reforms under Washington's leadership. These included mandatory activation of body cameras for all citizen contacts, a civilian review board with subpoena power, and a complete overhaul of the complaint investigation process. The Washington Protocols, as they came to be known, were being adopted by departments across the state as a model for constitutional policing and accountability. For Jason Miller, watching these developments from the sidelines was a bitter experience. His final public statement, given to a local reporter who tracked him down at a gas station outside town, revealed a man still struggling to comprehend the consequences of his actions. "I was just doing what I thought the job was," Miller said. "Nobody told me it would end like this. Nobody warned me. But the body camera footage told a different story, one of a clear warning given and ignored." As Sergeant Washington had calmly stated that day in his driveway, "Officer Miller, you are making a serious mistake right now. I want you to think very carefully about your next actions." Miller hadn't thought carefully enough, and now his career, reputation, financial stability, and freedom were all in jeopardy. The consequences had cascaded far beyond anything he could have imagined when he decided to question a black man washing his car in an affluent neighborhood. Do you believe police officers should face personal liability for civil rights violations, or should departments bear all responsibility? Has your community implemented body camera requirements and civilian oversight? Share your experiences below. By December 2025, 7 months after the driveway confrontation that exposed systemic issues within the Westlake Police Department. The full impact of Officer Jason Miller's actions had become devastatingly clear, not just for him personally, but for policing practices nationwide. On December 3rd, in a crowded federal courtroom, Judge Elaine Morales delivered the verdict in United States versus Miller. The former officer sat motionless as she read the jury's decision. Guilty on all counts, including deprivation of civil rights under color of law, filing false reports, and obstruction of justice. The evidence presented in this case demonstrates a flagrant disregard for constitutional protections that form the foundation of our justice system. Judge Morales stated during sentencing, "Mr. Miller, you were entrusted with extraordinary power and swore an oath to protect all citizens equally. Instead, you weaponized that authority based on personal bias. The sentence was unprecedented for the jurisdiction: 38 months in federal prison, 3 years of supervised release, and a prohibition from ever seeking employment in law enforcement or security services. This sentence sends a clear message that badge or no badge, those who violate citizens' civil rights will be held accountable," stated U.S. Attorney Rebecca Chun in her post-trial press conference. "No one is above the law, especially those entrusted to enforce it." Miller's fall from police officer to federal inmate was complete. Bureau of Prisons records show he was designated to FCI Petersburg, a medium security facility where former law enforcement officers are typically housed for their protection. The civil case brought by Sergeant Washington concluded with an equally significant outcome. Rather than proceeding to trial, the City Council approved a settlement agreement that went far beyond monetary damages. "This resolution isn't about money," Washington stated after the settlement was announced. "It's about creating lasting change in how policing is conducted in our community and ensuring that what happened to me doesn't happen to others who lack the protection of a badge." The Washington settlement, as it came to be known in legal circles, included a $1.75 million payment, which Washington directed to establish the Constitutional Policing Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to training officers on bias-free policing. Mandatory department-wide retraining on constitutional standards for investigative stops. Implementation of an early warning system to identify officers showing patterns of biased enforcement. Creation of a civilian oversight board with actual disciplinary authority. Quarterly public reporting of stop data broken down by race, reason, and outcome. The settlement terms were so comprehensive that they became a template adopted by civil rights attorneys nationwide in similar cases. For Lieutenant James Harmon, the consequences were equally severe. Faced with overwhelming evidence from the recorded roll call briefings and testimony from officers under his command, Harmon accepted a plea agreement on October 15th. He received 18 months in federal prison for conspiracy to violate civil rights and official misconduct. Harmon's case is particularly significant because it establishes that supervisors who create or permit a culture of discrimination can be held criminally liable, explained legal analyst Maria Gonzalez. This creates a powerful incentive for command staff to actively prevent, rather than ignore or enable, bias policing. The Department of Justice Pattern or Practice investigation concluded in November with findings that transformed not just the Westlake Police Department, but set new standards for agencies nationwide. Our investigation revealed a department that had systematically failed to identify and address discriminatory practices, stated Assistant Attorney General James Wilson. However, we also found a department that, under new leadership, has demonstrated unprecedented commitment to reform. Rather than imposing a consent decree, the typical outcome of such investigations, the DOJ entered into a collaborative reform agreement that recognized the changes already implemented under Sergeant Washington's leadership. Washington himself had been promoted to captain and placed in charge of the newly created Office of Constitutional Policing and Reform. His first official act was to implement what became known as the Washington Rule, a requirement that all officers document the specific, articulable facts justifying each investigatory stop, with regular audits to identify patterns of potentially biased enforcement. For Jason Miller, watching these developments from federal prison represented a painful education in the consequences of biased policing. His personal life had completely unraveled. His divorce was finalized in September. His home was lost to foreclosure in October, and his police pension was forfeited under state law following his felony conviction. Court records revealed that Miller had accumulated over $300,000 in legal debt with no means to pay it. His attorney withdrew from representing him in further appeals, citing non-payment of fees. A prison interview with journalist Elena Ramirez, published in the December issue of National Justice Review, revealed a man finally beginning to comprehend the magnitude of his actions. "I never saw myself as racist," Miller stated in the interview. "I thought I was just being proactive, doing what was expected. Now I understand that what I perceived as good policing was actually profiling based on bias I didn't even recognize in myself." When asked what he would say to Sergeant Washington now, Miller's response revealed the beginning of genuine reflection. "I would apologize not just for that day, but for failing to understand what it means to truly protect and serve everyone equally. He tried to give me a chance to think about my actions, and I didn't take it." For the 3 other officers implicated in the investigation, the outcomes varied based on their level of involvement and willingness to cooperate. 2 received suspensions and mandatory retraining, while Officer Rodriguez, who had come forward with the crucial evidence, was commended for her moral courage and eventually promoted to detective. Rodriguez exemplifies the type of ethical officer we need in modern policing, Chief Grayson stated at her promotion ceremony. She chose loyalty to the Constitution and the community over misplaced loyalty to colleagues engaged in misconduct. The Westlake case became required study at police academies nationwide. The body camera footage, with appropriate educational context, was incorporated into training curricula as a powerful example of how bias can manifest in policing and the severe consequences that can follow. By December 2025, the Washington Protocols had been adopted by over 200 police departments across the country. Captain Washington had been invited to testify before Congress on police reform and had become a respected voice in national conversations about constitutional policing. "What happened to my driveway that day was painful and humiliating," Washington reflected in his address to the graduating class of the State Police Academy in December. "But the real tragedy would have been if nothing changed as a result. Today, I can say with confidence that policing is changing, not just in Westlake, but across this country." For Jason Miller, federal inmate #47392-089, the consequences of that fateful decision to stop a black man washing his car in an affluent neighborhood would continue long after his eventual release. His felony record would permanently limit his employment opportunities. His professional certification was revoked in all 50 states, and his name had become synonymous with bias policing in law enforcement training materials. The final irony came on December 20th, when the Westlake City Council unanimously voted to rename the department's annual ethics award the Marcus Washington Medal of Honor, ensuring that the sergeant's dignified response to discrimination would be remembered by generations of future officers. As Washington accepted this recognition, he offered words that would serve as both the conclusion to this case and a beginning for a new era in policing. "What happened to me could have ended with anger and division. Instead, it has become a catalyst for necessary change. The measure of justice is not found in punishment alone, but in the transformation of systems that permit injustice to occur. Today, I can say that real transformation is underway." For Jason Miller, watching this ceremony on the small television in the prison common room, the full weight of his actions finally became clear. A momentary decision based on bias had not only destroyed his career and personal life, but had inadvertently launched a national movement for police accountability that would long outlast his prison sentence. The security camera that had captured the initial confrontation in Washington's driveway now hangs in the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, alongside the body camera that recorded Miller's fateful words. The accompanying plaque reads simply, "Sometimes justice requires seeing ourselves clearly." May 17th, 2025. What do you think is the most important lesson from this case? Has your community implemented any reforms similar to the Washington Protocols? Share your thoughts below on how we can ensure equal protection under the law for all citizens.